From 125th Street and Frederick Douglass Boulevard in Harlem, you're watching South Africa Now! Yeah!
Global Vision presents the television news magazine of Southern Africa.
It doesn't exist on television, and it doesn't exist.
I would actually appeal to the world that information is there and can be found.
Because it is important that people know what is happening.
This week, South Africa Now presents these stories. South Africa's President P.W. Botha resigns, and the ANC's Oliver Tambo is hospitalized. We'll have the latest news. Black Americans becoming Afrocentric. You can see it on the streets. But what does it mean for Southern Africa?
The concept of Afro or Afrocentricity formulates how you look at life, how you look at politics, how you look at culture, everything.
For you who are perpetrators of injustice and oppression must know that you are opposing God.
Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He's a very public person, and we'll have a very private report.
It is hard to have a father who you share with so many others.
All of these stories and more this week on South Africa Now. But first, the news with Fana, Kekana and Carolyn Craven.
Dumelang, the President of South Africa has resigned. In a dramatic series of events, State President P.W. Botha was forced out of office on August 14th after a showdown with members of his own cabinet and the man slated to replace him, F.W. de Klerk.
Botha's resignation came in an angry and rambling television address just 3 weeks before South Africa's elections scheduled for September 6th. Botha and de Klerk, who was sworn in as acting president, have feuded since Botha refused to leave office after suffering a stroke last January. The conflict came to a head over Botha's refusal to let de Klerk travel to Lusaka, Zambia, to meet with that country's president, Kenneth Kaunda. Kaunda is one of the strongest supporters of the African National Congress. The United Democratic Front, South Africa's largest anti-apartheid coalition, had this reaction to the news. No oppressed South African mourned the resignation of Mr. P.W. Botha. However, his resignation had little relevance as it was merely the man who was going and not the policy of apartheid. For an explanation of these events, we turn to political analyst Tom Lodge.
The alterations in South Africa's government that took place during the Botha years have been important ones. He will be remembered as the man who presided over a dramatic opening up of the South African political scene. I don't think he intended that to happen, but that's nevertheless what did happen during his time. The man that replaces P.W. Botha as state president is ideologically rather similar. I think it's significant because the man who's replaced him is more conciliatory in his personal style, less inflexible, he's younger, he's probably more intelligent, he's less bad-tempered. And all those things matter at this stage when the South African government's trying to win friends and influence people. Mr. Botha wasn't very good at doing that, particularly in his last years.
The highly publicized recent meeting between African National Congress leader Nelson Mandela and former State President P.W. Botha apparently wasn't the first time Mandela has met with government officials. There is a report this week that Mandela, who is being held at this government prison farm, was engaged in secret talks with high-ranking members of the South African government, including Justice Minister Kobie Coetsee, for almost 3 years. Some of those talks reportedly led to the release of a number of political prisoners. Also this week, Oliver Tambo, the president of the African National Congress, was flown from ANC headquarters in Lusaka, Zambia, to a London hospital. The 71-year-old Tambo, seen here at a recent meeting in Lusaka between South African whites and the ANC, was originally reported to have suffered a stroke, though a spokesperson now says the ANC president is resting from what is being described as fatigue.
The defiance campaign continues in South Africa. We have insider footage, including rare pictures of police breaking up a peaceful demonstration. Stuart Sender reports on what may become the greatest wave of civil disobedience ever in the long struggle against apartheid.
The funeral of 2 college students, anti-apartheid activists killed in a bomb explosion, became the focus for the campaign, as many of the mourners were there in defiance of restriction orders. Police were present too, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu confronted them during the procession.
I touched you. I said sorry. What's the matter with you?
Inside the church, there was a call for an end to state-sponsored violence against the peaceful demonstrations from the Reverend Allan Boesak.
And they are willing to face the guns and the dogs and the tear gas, and still, after having been so non-violent and peaceful, they are still shot at. They are still jailed, detained without trial. They are still tear gassed, not only on the streets, but even in the sanctuaries of their churches.
Only the night before, Boesak had led a candlelight vigil that was broken up with tear gas by the police.
Were you yourself tear gassed?
Oh, I was just joining the group when the tear gas came, and it's so I'm still a little bit smarting here.
And finally, this defiance campaign protest was broken up by police, who also arrested this Associated Press photographer. He found out, along with the person who shot this video, that South Africa's press censorship is still very much in effect. This is Stuart Sender reporting.
In the midst of the Defiance campaign came a celebration remembering National Women's Day. Last week's festivities brought together hundreds of women and men to commemorate August 9th, 1956, when thousands marched on Pretoria in protest of South Africa's past laws. Included in the event were some of the original organizers of the movement. Nadja Smith reports.
In a tribute to South African National Women's Day, hundreds gathered in Johannesburg to reaffirm their commitment to fight the oppression of women and blacks in South Africa. The annual event commemorates the March on Pretoria, held August 9, 1956, protesting the extension of past laws to women. The laws limited where they could live and work, tearing families apart. One of the founding members of the Federation of South African Women, Helen Joseph, recalls the historic day.
I don't think I can ever forget that moment when we got to the top, and I turned around once to look behind me, and I could see nothing but women, nothing but women, nothing but women. Women's faces, but it wasn't all women's faces. The women's face became one face. It was the face of the women of South Africa.
20,000 women of all races from all over South Africa converged on the Union Building in Pretoria. For a half hour, the women stood in silence, waiting for an answer that never came. But the action succeeded. The past laws were delayed for several years. African women had discovered the power of unified action.
In the name of the stalwarts who are in exiles and who are at home here, I say power to the people. With the defiance campaigns of this year, from the street to the church, from the church to the city, from the city to the life, we are the ones who are going to make it happen.
As the day's festivities drew to a close, it was apparent that the celebration had inspired women to continue to raise their voices in the struggle for a free South Africa. This is Nadja Smith reporting.
This week from Namibia, continued violence against Namibia's voters by South African-trained paramilitary units and more allegations that South Africa is attempting to rig the November elections. Joseph Disho has more in this week's Namibia Watch, our report on the United Nations-sponsored transition to independence in Africa's last colony.
Amidst continued reports of voter intimidation and election rigging by the South African administration in Namibia, SWAPO, the Namibian Liberation Movement, says the UN has lost control of the process. SWAPO's UN representative, Inyangerwa Sheke.
We see the UN having been reduced to mere observers, standing on the sideline. with South Africa making decisions and then forcing them to accept them.
SWAPO cites two main points. One, the continued presence of KUFUT, the brutal South African-trained paramilitary units which have been incorporated into Namibia's police, in spite of claims to the contrary by South Africa's Foreign Minister P.W.
I'm very much aware of a certain unit. In Afrikaans, this unit is called KUFUT. I understand that it is the intention to disband this unit.
And secondly, efforts by South Africa to register foreign nationals, including white South Africans and Angolans who are members of the South African-backed UNITA rebel movement, to vote against SWAPO and 4 political parties backed by Pretoria. At the United Nations, SWAPO representative A.F.R.I.C.A said conditions for free and fair elections don't exist, and if SWAPO's concerns are not addressed, the Namibian people might not honor the November elections.
We hope we do not have to be forced at one time to say we don't want to have anything to do with this process.
The United Nations has no comment on SWAPO's charges. However, there is movement in the U.S. Congress. Howard Wolpe, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, said he believes South Africa is, quote, doing everything it can to subvert free and fair elections. Wolpe is calling on Secretary of State Baker to intervene. This is Joseph Disho with Namibia Watch for South Africa Now.
You're watching South Africa Now, the television news magazine that goes behind the headlines.
Afrocentricity is the latest buzzword in many of America's Black or African American communities. A growing identification with Africa is becoming more visible. But will it mean more support for South Africa? That's the question we take on in our background report this week.
African American is the proper, formal, historical designation of those of us taken from here and sent into the diaspora.
Jesse Jackson appealed to Black Americans to call themselves African Americans, and today many are. In fact, on the streets of our inner cities, many of the gold chains are gone from kids' necks. In their place, African medallions.
It symbolizes Africa. This is the African symbol. Black for the skin, green for the earth, and reddish for the blood, sir.
Afrocentricity is the new buzzword. In this report, we'll look at the trend and its significance for Southern Africa.
Mookie! So you know I'm still... What? Come you got no brothers up on the wall? Man, ask Sal, right? Hey, Sal, how come you got no brothers up on the wall here?
In Spike Lee's movie, Do the Right Thing, one of the characters complains that no black heroes are on the wall of a Brooklyn pizzeria. Among the names he mentions is Nelson Mandela.
We want to be here for the long run. That's why I think that this won't be a fad.
I have this problem, this very delicate matter. I have a friend of mine who wants to immigrate to South Africa.
Yes, of course. I can certainly help him do that.
In another box office smash, Lethal Weapon 2, actor Danny Glover takes on the South Africans.
How you doing?
I think there must be some mistake.
If you go to any church that is truly, authentically African American, you won't get out in no 35, 45, or 60 minutes.
Africa is a theme in religion too. In Washington, D.C., Catholic priest George Stallings has broken away from the church to get closer to African culture.
We were being governed by a preponderantly Euro-American white male hierarchy that was simply culturally insensitive to the profound spiritual and cultural needs of African Americans.
Gotta give us what we need. Our freedom of speech is freedom of death. We got to fight the powers.
It's not just talking Africa, it's looking Africa. African hairdos are in. Brooklyn's Bill Lester runs Knaps, which specializes in African styles.
What we actually are doing here, we are internationalizing ourselves as African people, first of all. And we must start there because that's our foundation.
Lester also has designers creating whole lines of African clothing.
All these prints here are, as I said before, from the motherland,
and they're man-made. They are all man-made prints. So you find that the designs we would have upstairs are very much custom.
African pride is everywhere, from the latest in fashion to the hottest music. In Harlem, a South African exile runs one of the hippest music shops.
Come along, let me show you the real McCoy, the African section here. This is the music I've been working on for over 20 years, and I'm proud to say that it has blossomed to this point. We have the sounds of Soweto, great hit. People love this. It sells like hotcakes. When we bring all this beautiful music and culture, it kind of opens up the eyes, and people say, wow, Africa is beautiful. Hey, listen to that music. It's something different. It's something which I need to relate to.
South Africa no free, neither will we. Free South Africa!
The Africa link has popped up in rap music too. Here's Stetson Sonic.
South Africa no free, neither are we. Those are our brothers and sisters across the sea.
Afrocentricity was even explored by an all-star panel at this year's New Music Seminar.
The concept of Afro or Afrocentricity is using Africa as your base for living and culture, or even if you are African American, using your African American and African Caribbean culture as a base. And that pretty much formulates how you look at life, how you look at politics, how you look at culture, everything.
A South African, theater promoter Duma Lovo, said there is a parallel.
Is the whole thing about rap music and the African medallions, and just moving young kids to walking around with a map of Africa in there. So I think the next step now for particularly rap musicians and some of the educators in the community is now to explain to the young kids what those medallions are all about.
All the panelists seem to agree, including filmmaker Spike Lee, Public Enemy's Chuck D, writer Nelson George, and rocker Vernon Reid. But their emphasis has so far been more on racial pride and black entrepreneurship than political activism. Hard questions remain about where the movement is headed. Harlem activist Ilambe Brath.
Now the problem today is how to get around what happened before. How do we bring the cultural and the political so that the people who also make money can actually help to sustain the movement so that we can really lead toward the genuine liberation of African people, both in the United States and Africa itself.
Not a new phenomenon that black kids identify with Africa, no way. I identified with Africa. My great-grandmother identified with Africa. That's nothing new.
African-American journalist Jerry Augusto, seen here translating for Jesse Jackson in Angola where she lives, believes that the black community is not getting enough information about African reality.
It's not their fault if that doesn't happen, because who educates people? Schools educate people, media educate people, and social institutions educate people. So those who would want to see those children with a better understanding, those children and other American children, have to work on getting the people who make the information to understand and to get different kinds of images and different kinds of information out.
Education is key. Some Africans, like the team behind the African Connection newspaper, are trying to inform Black America. Editor Nyama Kojo.
It is a paper that is here to bring out, of course, to report on news, but also to bring out most of the positive things that are happening in Africa and among Africans everywhere that you don't hear about, so that it can help to empower them and to see the better aspects of themselves and to encourage them to do even more.
Music promoter Lisa Williamson says the connection can be made.
If you go up to Harlem and you look at the unemployment rate and you look at the way brothers and sisters are sitting around without jobs and you look at the dilapidated economic system there and you say, this is an example of a Bantustan in South Africa. In South Africa, brothers and sisters are unemployed in the same ways.
But the larger challenge for those drawn to Africa by bonds of blood and cultural identity is to fuse their nationalistic feelings with an internationalist concern, to relate to Southern Africa's political fight for liberation. Black pride and racial solidarity is just the first step.
You're watching South Africa Now. Coming up next, our culture segment, featuring the best music, film, drama, and artistic expression from Southern Africa.
This week, our culture segment highlights the author of a book who has compiled the thoughts of South Africa's Nobel laureate, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The author knows the man and his message in an intimate and very personal way. She is Naomi Tutu, one of Archbishop Tutu's daughters.
We know that our God is on the side of those whose noses are rubbed in the dust.
Archbishop Desmond Tutu has for years brought the plight of South Africa's oppressed majority into the international spotlight. In 1984, Tutu, the Archbishop of Cape Town, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Always in the news, always in the public eye, few really know the private side of Desmond Tutu. His daughter Naomi, editor of the Words of Desmond Tutu, lends some insight into this man.
He's very funny. He's very silly often too, and people have a very hard time realizing that he can be as silly and sillier than most people.
You remember the story of the Zambian and the South African were having a conversation, and the Zambian then said to the South African in the course of that conversation, yes, and of course our Minister of Naval Affairs. And the South African said, what? Minister of Naval Affairs? You come from a landlocked country. How can you have a Minister of Naval Affairs? And the Zambian said, oh well, you do have a Minister of Justice in South Africa, don't you?
He is silly, he is fun. And I think that is one of the ways of keeping sane in a situation such as South Africa, that you have to have an enjoyment of life, have to have an appreciation of the funnier side of things.
Here in Cape Town, Tutu addresses a group of parents of detainees.
You are a very special person. Now come on, everybody. I am a very special person.
Tutu's sense of humor and optimistic outlook on life are assets, considering he is under constant attack from the South African government. In August of 1988, the headquarters of the South African Council of Churches was destroyed by a bomb.
This used to be my office. I left it in good condition. I mean, he can't keep it for a year. I mean, you get a disgrace.
Another example of the government's attempt to discredit him is this pamphlet distributed on the streets of Cape Town.
The kind of smear tactics that the government uses have obviously, had an impact on us. You wake up in the morning and you find these pamphlets all over our garden.
Tutu's fiery speaking style has led some to call him a politician, yet as he maintains, he's still a priest.
You don't need Das Kapital. You don't need a political manifesto. You don't need anything that could ever reach the subversive quality of our faith. And you say to them, hey, you who ban all kinds of literature, you are late. You are too late. You are too late. For nothing could be more revolutionary in a situation of injustice and oppression than the Bible.
Tutu maintains that his criticism of the apartheid system is rooted in his faith, however great the risk may be.
I tend to say I am doing God's work, and I hope that He will look after me. But in any case, who said anyone was indispensable? And if you are a Christian and believe in the resurrection, who says death is the worst thing that could happen to you?
It's not something that we sit around saying, well, if he's killed, and it really doesn't matter, because it is something that is obviously worrying to us. He is my father, he's somebody I love, and I'd love to see him playing with my children one day. But it is also something that we have learnt to deal with in saying that if my father is killed, that is not the end of the world for us. And it is definitely not the end of the world for the struggle. And I think that is the important thing to know, that the struggle continues and our lives continue.
What's remarkable about Tutu is his deep faith and inspirational leadership. He is a man whose vulnerability is always on display.
He says that the church's role, his role as a church leader, is to be the conscience of whoever is doing wrong within the country, so that he must be able to speak out where he sees wrong within the movement and where he sees, when he sees wrong in the government.
Thank you for watching South Africa Now. You can listen to us in a new radio edition, which we will make available to interested radio stations. We are also on the air on 50 PBS stations and are hearing from many more viewers. We were especially pleased by the mail we've received as a result of our recent appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show. For a resource list on the issues we cover or to purchase a transcript, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to South Africa Now, P.O. Box 1907, Canal Street Station, New York 10013. Transcripts are $3. Ask for show N103. South Africa Now is produced by Global Vision on a non-profit basis in association with the Africa Fund. Thank you for joining us. We close our program with more musical highlights from the National Women's Day celebration in Johannesburg. For everyone here at South Africa Now, I'm Fana Kekana. See you next week.